Hello, sleepy detectives, and welcome back. I know you're here to settle in and relax, so if you enjoy these stories, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I love knowing where our community is. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let's get comfortable and jump straight into tonight's story.
November 16th, 1957, dawned cold and brittle over Plainfield, Wisconsin. The winds of an early winter had already arrived, dusting the small farming community of just a few hundred people with a quiet, blanketing snow. This was the kind of place where front doors were rarely locked, where everyone knew their neighbor's business, and where the greatest anxieties revolved around the harvest or the high school football game. It was the American heartland, insulated and safe. And it was this profound sense of safety that made the revelations of that day so utterly foundation-shattering. Bernice Worden was a fixture in Plainfield. At 58, she was a pragmatic, hard-working widow who ran the Worden hardware store. It was more than just a place for tools. It was a local hub where farmers gathered for coffee, gossip, and a gallon of antifreeze. Her son, Frank Worden, was the town's deputy sheriff. He had stopped by that morning to chat with his mother before heading out on a hunting trip, a completely normal interaction he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. When Frank returned to town around 5 p.m., the early winter darkness had already fallen. He drove past his mother's store and immediately felt a prickle of unease. The building was dark. Bernice was reliably open until this time, and the lights should have been on. He pulled over and went inside. The silence was heavy. "Mom?" he called out. No answer. He flipped the light switch. The store was empty. Frank's unease sharpened into alarm when he looked at the cash register. It was open. But it wasn't just the missing money that seized his attention. It was the floor. A dark, sticky patch had pooled near the register, and a slick, crimson trail led directly out the back door. Outside, in the falling snow, Frank could see where the stain continued, ending where the store's delivery truck should have been. The truck was gone. His law enforcement instincts took over. He scanned the counter, searching for any clue. He found the day's sales ledger. The very last entry, the final transaction of his mother's life, was a sales slip for 1 gallon of antifreeze. The name written on the slip was Ed Gain. Everyone in Plainfield knew Ed Gain. Eddie, as they called him, was the town eccentric. A 51-year-old bachelor, he lived in utter squalor on his family's isolated, dilapidated farm 6 miles outside of town. He was the local handyman, the odd job man. He fixed fences, repaired machinery, and, astonishingly to those who would later learn the truth, he was a trusted babysitter for several local families. Eddie was peculiar. He was socially awkward, with a strange, high-pitched giggle that seemed to erupt at inappropriate moments. He had a shy, almost childlike demeanor, and his eyes seldom met another's. But he was considered harmless. "That's just Eddie," the townsfolk would say, dismissing him as a simple, lonely soul who wasn't all there. But standing in the cold, empty hardware store, Deputy Frank Worden remembered something else. He remembered the rumors that had swirled around Plainfield for years. And he remembered the disappearance of another woman. 3 years earlier, in 1954, Mary Hogan had vanished. Mary was the boisterous, rough-talking owner of Hogan's Tavern, a watering hole in the nearby hamlet of Pine Grove. One morning, a patron found the tavern empty, a large crimson stain on the floor, and a spent .32 caliber cartridge case nearby. Mary was gone. At the time, locals had made a dark, morbid joke. Maybe Eddie Gein took her home. Eddie had been a frequent visitor to the tavern, often staring at Mary with a strange, unnerving focus. Now, that joke was no longer funny. The sales slip in Frank's hand wasn't just a clue. It was a terrifying confirmation. He immediately contacted his superior, Sheriff Art Schley. Schley was initially skeptical. Eddie Gein?
It seemed impossible. But a woman was missing. A scene of violence was evident, and Gein was the last person documented to have seen her. It was their only lead. As the night deepened, Shelley and Warden drove the 6 miles of dark, snow-covered country roads to the Gein farm. The property was an island of decay, set far back from the main road, hidden by overgrown trees. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story wreck, its paint peeled away decades ago, its windows boarded up or broken. The entire yard was a graveyard of rusting machinery, rotting tires, and skeletal remains of old cars. They called his name. Ed! Eddie! Only the wind answered. The house was dark. The doors were locked. Schley aimed his flashlight beam through a grimy kitchen window. The inside was not just messy, it was choked. Piles of garbage, old newspapers, magazines, tin cans, and unidentifiable filth were stacked in towering, precarious columns. The air itself seemed thick with a foul odor, a sweet, cloying stench of decay that was palpable even from outside. They had no choice. They broke down the door to a side room, what had once been a summer kitchen. The smell hit them like a physical blow. It was the smell of spoiled food, of animal waste, of mildew, and something else entirely. Something metallic and rancid. They waded through the debris, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The house was cold, without power or running water. They moved from the summer kitchen into the main kitchen, which was in even worse condition. Gein, it seemed, lived in only this one room, having sealed off the rest of the house. As Schley entered a small adjoining woodshed, something brushed against his shoulder in the dark. He flinched, swinging his flashlight beam upwards. The light landed on a shape hanging from a meat hook on the ceiling rafters. In the first disorienting second, his mind registered it as a common sight in hunting season, a dressed deer, field-prepped and ready for butchering. But Frank Worden, standing just behind him, had his light aimed lower. He saw the ankles. He saw the feet. Human feet. Art! Worden breathed, his voice cracking. My God, Art! Schley moved his light. The hanging figure was not a deer. It was a human body, suspended upside down. The head was absent. The torso had been opened down the front, the internal organs removed, in a manner identical to that of a hunter processing game. It was Bernice Worden. Sheriff Schley, a hardened veteran of law enforcement, stumbled backward out of the shed, gagging, fighting back sickness. Frank Worden was frozen for a moment. The horrific, grotesque image of his mother's desecrated remains burned into his memory. They retreated from the house, slamming the door as if to contain the nightmare, and radioed for every available unit, for the state crime lab, for everyone. Word soon came that Ed Gein had been located. He was at a general store in West Plainfield, calmly interacting with the owner. Officers converged and took him into custody. He offered no resistance, just his strange, giggling confusion as they placed him in the car. Back at the farm, the full investigative team arrived, equipped with gas masks and powerful floodlights. As they began the systematic, painstaking search of the property, the full scope of Ed Gein's world was revealed. It was not just the scene of a single brutal act. It was a workshop, a museum of the macabre. They moved past the main kitchen into the rest of the house. The parlor and the downstairs bedroom were sealed, boarded up from the inside. When they forced them open, they found them preserved in perfect, dusty stillness, exactly as they had been when Ed's mother was alive. It was a shrine. But upstairs, in Ed's own bedroom and a connecting sewing room, they found his collection. On a small table, they found a bowl. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was the top half of a human cranium,
sawn neatly in half and polished smooth. There were several more. In a box, they found a set of tableware crafted from similar materials. A lampshade on a bedside table was not made of cloth. It was made of skin, a tight, yellowish, translucent parchment pulled taut over a wire frame. Looking closer, the investigators could make out the faint traces of a human face, the texture of the lips, the empty sockets of the eyes. The horrors mounted with every step. They found a chair, its seat upholstered not with vinyl, but with panels of pale, patterned human hide. They found a belt crafted from a row of severed human nipples. They found a window shade pull consisting of a pair of human lips strung together on a string. They found leggings carefully fashioned from the skin of human legs. In a shoebox, they found a collection of 9 items carefully preserved. At first, they looked like rubber Halloween masks. They were not. They were the actual faces of 9 different women, peeled from the skull, tanned like leather, and some still bearing traces of makeup. And then, in a closet, they found the most terrifying creation of all. It was a suit, a complete female torso, including the breasts, meticulously flayed from a body, preserved, and designed to be worn like a vest. The seasoned investigators, men who had seen the worst of humanity, were undone. This was not the work of a criminal. This was the work of something else, something they had no name for. They now understood that Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan were not the beginning. They were simply the end. The sheer volume of human artifacts meant there had to be more, dozens more. Was Ed Gein the most prolific serial predator in American history, operating undetected for decades? When questioned, Gein was calm, almost detached. He admitted to the incidents involving Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He claimed his rifle had just gone off in both cases. But what about the house? What about the collection? His answer was, in many ways, more disturbing than the alternative. He claimed he hadn't harmed all those other people. He had, he explained, procured them. In the years after his mother's passing, he had developed a pastime. He would read the local newspaper obituaries. When a woman of a certain age, a woman who reminded him of his mother, was recently interred, he would wait for a dark night. He and a local acquaintance, a man named Gus, would visit the Plainfield Cemetery. Gein described being in a daze-like state. He and Gus would unearth the recent burials. Sometimes, he said, the bodies were not in good condition, and he would put them back. But other times, he would take the bodies, or specific parts, and transport them home in his truck. Gus, later found to be cognitively impaired, seemed to have been a semi-willing, half-aware participant. To verify this unbelievable story, investigators went to the cemetery. They exhumed 3 of the graves Gein had mentioned. The caskets were empty, or in one case, the body within had been severely compromised, just as Gein had described. The news hit Plainfield like a second shockwave. It was not just that their quiet neighbor was a monster. It was that he had violated their most sacred spaces. He had plundered the graves of their mothers, their sisters, their aunts. The dead themselves were not safe. The question now shifted from what to why. What could possibly motivate a human being to do this? A team of psychiatrists was brought in to delve into the mind of Ed Gein. What they found was a story not of inherent evil, but of a profound and tragic psychological collapse. A story that had begun decades earlier, centered entirely on one person, Augusta Gein. Augusta was a looming, tyrannical figure. She was a ferocious religious zealot, a woman who saw the entire world as a cauldron of sin and degradation. In her eyes, all other women were vessels of temptation, agents of the devil. She relentlessly preached to her two sons, Henry and Ed, about the evils of strong drink, idleness, and, above all, the inherent sinfulness of women. Ed's father, George, was a weak, alcoholic man whom Augusta openly despised. She had purchased the isolated 160-acre farm precisely to remove her family from the corrupting influences of the city, to create a prison where she could have total control. Ed, a shy, timid, and somewhat effeminate boy, became the sole focus of her suffocating attention. She abused him verbally, calling him a failure, while simultaneously pulling him closer, reading him graphic, terrifying passages from the Old Testament every night. He was terrified of her, and he adored her. She was his entire world. His older brother, Henry, was more independent. He began to challenge Augusta, even speaking ill of her in front of Ed. In 1944, Henry and Ed were burning brush on the property when the fire supposedly got out of control. After the fire was extinguished, Ed reported Henry missing. His body was found later, lying face down. He was unharmed by the flames. The coroner, in a hasty examination, ruled the passing an accident. But years later, investigators would note that the body had unexplained bruises on its head. Had Ed, in a fit of rage defending his mother's honor, struck his own brother? With Henry gone, and his father having perished earlier, Ed had finally achieved Augusta's dream. He was all hers. Then, in 1945, Augusta herself suffered a massive stroke and passed. At 39 years old, Ed Gein was, for the first time in his life, completely and terrifyingly alone. The one defining, organizing force in his universe was gone, and his mind, held together only by her rigid control, began to unravel. His isolation was total. He sealed off his mother's rooms, preserving them as a shrine. The rest of the house, like his mind, descended into chaos and filth. He was tormented by a conflict he could not resolve. He loved his mother, yet he was consumed by the very urges she had taught him to despise. He became obsessed with women, not in a normal way, but in a fractured, terrifying one. He began to read. He consumed medical textbooks, studies on anatomy, and lurid pulp magazines detailing the atrocities of Nazi concentration camps. He became fascinated by the female form, but only in a detached, clinical, disassembled way. The grave robbing began. He was, in his mind, looking for replacements for Augusta. He brought them home. But it soon became clear he didn't just want to be with them. He began his experiments. He started to skin them. He wanted to know what it felt like to be a woman. And in the final, horrifying leap of his psychosis, he decided he no longer wanted to just resurrect his mother. He wanted to become her. The female suit, the masks, the leggings, these were his tools of transformation. He admitted to investigators that he would put on these human relics, this suit of skin, and walk around the farmhouse, dancing and moving in the moonlight. He was trying to crawl inside the skin of a woman, to physically manifest the female presence he both craved and loathed. He was becoming Augusta. For years, the graves provided what he needed. But by 1954, the urge changed. The static, cold remains were no longer enough. He needed something fresh. He escalated from scavenger to predator. Mary Hogan was first. Perhaps her loud, abrasive personality reminded him of his mother's domineering presence. Then, 3 years later, Bernice Worden, another strong, independent widow running her own business, just as Augusta had run the farm. He was reenacting his own twisted psychological drama, finding surrogates for the mother he could not live with and could not live without. This is the central truth that makes the case of Ed Gein so much more terrifying than any Halloween movie. Fictional monsters like Michael Myers are presented as pure evil, a boogeyman, a shape. We can't understand him, so we are simply afraid of him. Fictional characters like Leatherface, inspired by Gein, are reduced to simple animalistic brutes, protecting their territory. Ed Gein was real. He was not a demon. He was a broken man. He was the product of decades of isolation and profound psychological abuse. He was the quiet neighbor. He was the gentle babysitter. The fact that a single human being could contain both of these realities, the polite handyman and the craftsman of a human skin lampshade, is a truth more unsettling than any supernatural horror. The films he inspired had to dilute the reality. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho took the psychological core, the overbearing mother, the son trapped in her shadow. But Norman Bates and his mother personality are a neat, understandable, cinematic simplification of Gein's chaotic, filthy, and profoundly sad reality. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre took the set dressing, the house of horrors, the furniture of bone and skin, but it discarded the complex why, replacing it with a simple, brutal what. The Silence of the Lambs came closest to the motive. The antagonist, Buffalo Bill, is making a woman suit. This is a direct lift from Gein's deepest obsession. But even there, the character is presented as methodical, driven by a clear, albeit twisted, goal. It misses the sheer, abject chaos of Gein's mind. A mind that wasn't just trying to change, but was trying to hold on to the very person who had destroyed him. No Hollywood script would dare to show the full picture. The filth, the smell, the pathetic, heartbreaking tragedy of a man dancing in the moonlight, wearing the face of a stranger, just to feel close to his mother again. In the end, Ed Gein was found legally unfit to stand trial. He was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent the remainder of his life at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, and later the Mendota Mental Health Institute. And here is the final chilling footnote. In the hospital, Ed Gein was known as a model patient. He was quiet, polite, and cooperative. He did odd jobs, he read books. The staff described him as a gentle, harmless old man. The monster that had terrified a nation was, it seemed, gone. Or perhaps, with Augusta's needs finally silenced by his institutionalization, it simply had no reason to come out. He passed away from respiratory failure in 1984. Back in Plainfield, the town tried to erase the stain. The Gein farmhouse, a potential magnet for dark tourism, mysteriously burned to the ground in 1958, widely believed to be a deliberate act of cleansing by the locals. His car, the one used to transport Bernice Worden, was sold at auction and taken on a gruesome carnival circuit, displayed as Ed Gein's ghoul car. But the town itself never recovered. The locked doors in Plainfield stayed locked. The innocence of the small, trusting community was gone forever. Ed Gein had not just taken 2 lives. He had not just violated the sanctity of their graveyard. He had shown them, in the most graphic way possible, the monster that could be hiding behind the shy, giggling mask of their neighbor. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper, but for the people who knew him, it never really ended. And while that family was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, another investigation was just starting, and it was even harder to explain. It began in a peaceful cabin in the woods with a scene of unimaginable violence and a 12-year-old girl who had vanished into thin air. The Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California are a place of staggering, profound beauty. They are also a place of deep, almost suffocating isolation. Tucked away in these vast forests along the Feather River lies the community of Keddie. In 1981, Keddie was not so much a town as a memory. It was a former railroad hub and logging outpost that had seen its prime come and go. By the early 1980s, the Keddie Resort, once a bustling destination, had fallen into disrepair. It had become a collection of rustic, run-down cabins, a place of last resort for people drifting through, or for those with nowhere else to go. It was a place where people could disappear, existing in the margins, surrounded by the silent, indifferent pines. It was to this place, to Cabin 28, that Glenna Sue Sharp had come to build a new life. Sue, at 36, was a survivor. She had recently fled a difficult, abusive relationship in Connecticut, bringing her 5 children across the country to find a fresh start. Cabin 28, a small 2-bedroom wooden structure, was cramped for a family of 6, but it was theirs, and it was safe, or so she believed. Her children were her world. John, the oldest at 15, was a typical teenager, full of restless energy. Sheila, 14, was compassionate and responsible, often acting as a second mother to the younger ones. Tina, 12, was bright and curious. And then there were the little boys, Rick, 10, and Greg, just 5 years old. They were a tight-knit family, bound by their shared journey and their escape from a troubled past. The night of April 11, 1981, began with the mundane, familiar rhythms of family life. Sue was at home. The 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, were there, along with a 12-year-old friend, Justin Smart, who was staying for a sleepover. John, 15, and his 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate, had spent the day in the nearby town of Quincy and were expected back at the cabin later that evening. Sheila, 14, had made plans to spend the night next door in Cabin 26 with the Seabolt family. Tina, 12, was home, having finished her homework. It was a normal Saturday night in Ketty. The air was cold and crisp, the woods were dark, and the resort was quiet. At approximately 7 a.m. the next morning, April 12th, Sheila Sharp left the Seabolt's cabin and walked the few yards back to Cabin 28. She was expecting to be greeted by the sounds of her younger brothers watching cartoons. She pushed open the front door, which she found unlocked. The cabin was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, thick, unnatural stillness, and there was a smell. A coppery, metallic odor that hung in the air, a smell she couldn't immediately place. She stepped into the small living room, and her world ended. What she saw was not real. It couldn't be. The room was a scene of absolute, incomprehensible carnage. 3 figures were on the floor, bound tightly with loops of electrical wire and strips of white medical tape. They were almost unrecognizable. Her mother, Sue, was lying on her side near the sofa, gagged with a blue bandana that was held in place with more tape. Her 15-year-old brother, John, was nearby. A few feet away lay the 3rd figure, John's friend, Dana Wingate. All 3 had been subjected to a level of violence that was beyond imagination. The bindings were so tight they had cut into their skin. They had been brutalized with multiple weapons. A steak knife was found on the floor, its blade bent at a 30-degree angle from the sheer force of its use. A hammer, later identified as a claw hammer, was also found, covered in blood. The walls, the ceiling, the furniture, everything was marked by the evidence of a prolonged, frantic, and extraordinarily violent struggle. Sheila, in a state of shock so profound she was almost detached, backed away. Her mind, trying to protect itself, latched onto one thought: the little boys. She ran to the back bedroom where Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin were supposed to be sleeping. She threw open the door. And there they were, the 3 boys, huddled in their beds, completely and totally unharmed. They were alive. They were awake. They were just quiet. They had, in some impossible miracle, slept through, or at least survived, the horrific events that had unfolded just one thin wall away. Sheila grabbed them, pulling them from the room, shielding their eyes from the nightmare in the living room, and fled back to Cabin 26, screaming. When law enforcement from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office arrived, they stepped into a scene of chaos. The small cabin was a house of horrors. But as the initial shock wore off, the officers, and Sheila realized something else. Someone was missing. Sue was there, John was there, Dana was there. The 3 little boys were safe, but 12-year-old Tina Sharp was not in the cabin.
She was not in the living room. She was not in the bedroom with her brothers. She had vanished. The investigation that followed has since become a case study in failure. The scene, which should have been sealed immediately, was compromised. In the first few hours, dozens of people, neighbors, onlookers, and even officers with little to no training in homicide investigation trampled through Cabin 28. Evidence was destroyed, moved, or hopelessly contaminated. The small, isolated department was completely overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and complexity of the crime. This was not just a home invasion. It was a massacre. And it was an abduction. Investigators were faced with a series of agonizing, contradictory questions. First, the witnesses. What had the 3 boys in the back room heard? Rick and Greg, Sue's own sons, were too young and traumatized to provide coherent details. But the visitor, 12-year-old Justin Smart, had a story. He claimed he'd had a dream. In the dream, he saw 2 men in the living room with Sue. One had a mustache and glasses. The other was tall, with long hair. He described hearing muffled sounds, a struggle. Was it a dream, or was it a real memory filtered through the terror of a child? Justin was later placed under hypnosis by investigators, a now discredited technique. His story shifted. He now claimed he had seen John and Dana enter the living room and begin to argue with Sue, and that 2 other men had intervened. The accounts were confusing and unreliable, but they pointed to one key fact: the perpetrators were likely not strangers. Second, the suspects. The investigation quickly focused on 2 men. The first was Justin Smart's own stepfather, Martin Smart. Martin, a veteran, lived with his wife Marilyn, who was also a friend of Sue's, in a nearby cabin. He had a volatile reputation. Bizarrely, Martin was one of the first people to discover the scene after Sheila ran for help. Witnesses described his behavior as oddly calm, almost detached. Then, Marilyn Smart, Martin's wife, came to the police with a letter. It was a letter Martin had written to her shortly after the incident, before he abruptly left town. In it, he wrote, "I've paid the price of your love." A cryptic, chilling phrase. What price? And how is it connected to what happened in Cabin 28? The second suspect was a man named Beau Boubet. Boubet was an acquaintance of Martin Smart's and had been staying with him at the time of the events. Boubet was not a local. He was a career criminal from Chicago with alleged ties to organized crime. He, too, had vanished from Ketty almost immediately after the incident. The theory began to form. Had Martin and Beau gone to Cabin 28 that night? Had a confrontation with Sue, or perhaps with John and Dana, escalated into unimaginable violence? And this is where the Ketty case leaves the realm of a typical horror movie and enters a space that is far more terrifying. Hollywood horror, especially films like The Strangers, which shares a chilling resemblance to the Ketty story, relies on the terror of the unknown. The motive, as the fictional perpetrators state, is simple: because you were home. It is terrifying because it is random. It suggests that safety is an illusion, that at any moment, chaos can walk through your front door. But the reality of Ketty is infinitely more complex, and therefore, more frightening. The evidence did not point to random perpetrators. It pointed to people Sue Sharp knew. It pointed to her neighbors, to the stepfather of the boy sleeping in her children's bedroom. The horror was not random, it was personal. And then there is the detail that defies all cinematic logic: the sparing of the 3 boys. In a slasher film, the monster is thorough. The objective is a body count. No witnesses are left behind. But in Cabin 28, the perpetrators spent hours inside. The violence inflicted on Sue, John, and Dana was not quick. It was prolonged, agonizing, and loud. The perpetrators knew there were 3 children in the next room. They heard them. They were aware of them.
and they left them. Why? Why would perpetrators of such extreme violence, who had gone so far, simply stop? Why leave 3 living witnesses who could potentially identify them? This single inexplicable fact shatters any comparison to simple fiction. It suggests a motive that is bafflingly specific. Were the boys intentionally spared? Did the perpetrators know them? Was the violence directed only at Sue and the 2 teenagers? This isn't the work of a faceless boogeyman. It's the work of a human being, or human beings, making a series of conscious, chilling, and inexplicable decisions. And finally, there was the abduction. The perpetrators did not just commit a horrific act and flee. They took Tina Sharp. Why her? The 12-year-old girl. Was she the motive? Was the entire event a smokescreen to acquire her? Or was she simply a witness they could not leave behind, unlike her younger brothers? The case went cold. The trail of Smart and Bubaid vanished. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office, facing criticism for its handling of the investigation, seemed to let the file gather dust. For 3 agonizing years, the Sharp family, Sheila and her father, who had been estranged from Sue, were left with a gaping hole. The community of Keddie, already on its last legs, became a ghost town, haunted by the events of Cabin 28. Then, in 1984, the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle was found. A bottle collector was scouring the woods near Camp 18, a remote area in neighboring Butte County, nearly 30 miles from Keddie. There, in the underbrush, he found a partial human cranium and a jawbone. The remains were sent for analysis. A forensic odontologist matched the teeth to Tina Sharp's dental records. After 3 years, her fate was known. She had not been spared. She had been taken from the cabin, brought to this remote location, and her life was ended there. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Chillingly, an anonymous call had been made to the sheriff's office before the remains were officially identified, stating that the skull belonged to Tina Sharp. This meant the caller had intimate knowledge of the crime. Years turned into decades. The case became a dark legend, a campfire story about a haunted cabin. But for the survivors, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, it was a waking nightmare. In 2013, a new sheriff was elected in Plumas County. He, along with a determined new detective, reopened the Keddie case. They began to systematically go through the old evidence, applying modern technology to the contaminated, decades-old items. They found new evidence. They recovered a hammer from a local pond, one that matched the description of a hammer Martin Smart had claimed to have lost around the time of the incident. They re-interviewed witnesses. A therapist who had counseled Justin Smart after the events came forward, stating that Justin had told him he had witnessed the entire thing and that his stepfather, Martin, was one of the perpetrators. Justin, now an adult, recanted this, still holding to his dream story, but the implication was clear. A recording from Martin Smart to his wife, analyzed by the FBI, which seemed to further implicate him. The picture that emerged was one of a local conspiracy. A confrontation, perhaps over Sue's attempt to help Marilyn Smart leave her abusive husband, that spiraled out of control. It involved Martin Smart, Bo Bubaid, and possibly others. They had entered the cabin, a violent argument erupted, and it had turned into a frenzy. But the key players were gone. Bo Bubaid had passed in 1988. Martin Smart had passed in 2000. They had taken their secrets with them. The horror of Keddie. The reason it is so much more disturbing than The Strangers is that it is real and it is unresolved. The monsters were not masked phantoms who came from the woods. They were neighbors. They were acquaintances. They were people who had, perhaps just hours earlier, shared a friendly nod with Sue Sharp. And they got away with it. They got away with it because of a contaminated scene, a failed investigation, and a community code of silence. The horror lies in the incompetence, the missed opportunities, and the chilling, personal nature of the violence.
It lies in the image of three small boys, alone in the dark, listening to the end of their family's world, and the calculated decision by the perpetrators to simply close the door and leave them be. It's a story with no third act. There is no final confrontation, no unmasking of the villain. There is only the cold, silent cabin, the 30-year search for answers, and the grim knowledge that the people responsible lived out their lives and perhaps passed away peacefully in their beds, carrying the weight of what they did in Cabin 28. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper. But for the people who knew them, it never really ended. And while that family was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, another investigation was just starting, and it was even harder to explain. It began not in a remote cabin, but in a sun-drenched college town, a place of youthful promise. It began with the excited buzz of a new semester, and it would end in a 72-hour reign of terror that would inspire one of the most famous horror movies of all time. The end of August in Gainesville, Florida, is not just a time, it is a feeling. It is a wave of humid heat mixed with the electric, palpable energy of a new beginning. In 1990, the University of Florida was the beating heart of the town, and as the last weeks of summer burned away, tens of thousands of students were pouring back onto campus. The air was thick with the sounds of moving trucks, reunion parties, and the boundless, optimistic promise of a new school year. It was a place of sun-drenched sidewalks, youthful ambition, and a communal sense of absolute safety. It was the last time, for a very long time, that anyone in Gainesville would feel that way. The terror did not begin with a scream. It began with silence. On Sunday, August 26th, friends of 17-year-old Christina Powell and 18-year-old Sonia Larson grew concerned. The two young women, both incoming freshmen, had been unreachable all day. They had plans. Calls went unanswered. It was unusual, but in the happy chaos of move-in weekend, it was not yet a full-blown alarm. That afternoon, a friend drove to their off-campus apartment at Williamsburg Village. The door was unlocked. The friends stepped inside, calling their names. The apartment was quiet. In the living room, on the sofa, she saw a figure. It was Christina Powell. She appeared to be asleep. But the stillness was wrong. As the friend moved closer, the scene resolved into a nightmare. Christina was not asleep. She had been subjected to a horrific, methodical assault. Her body was positioned, her hands crossed. Panicked, the friend ran to the bedroom, searching for Sonia. She found her there, on the floor. Sonia, too, had been overpowered. And she, too, had been posed, arranged in a way that was chillingly deliberate. The scene was not one of frenzied rage. It was one of cold, terrifying control. The perpetrator had spent time there. He had bound them with tape. He had, investigators would later note, even taken the time to wipe down surfaces, a futile attempt to erase his presence. The discovery sent the first sharp shockwave through the law enforcement community. But the public, the thousands of students still moving into their dorms, did not yet know. They would learn soon enough. The next morning, Monday, August 27th, the second wave hit. 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, a bright student who worked as a records clerk at the sheriff's office, failed to show up for her 8 a.m. shift. This was unheard of. Krista was responsible, a creature of habit. An officer was dispatched to her apartment just a few miles from the first scene. He arrived to find a horrifyingly familiar sign. The front door was ajar. He entered the apartment, his hand on his weapon. This scene was different. It was not quiet control. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated savagery. A struggle had taken place. Furniture was overturned. But the worst was in the bedroom. Krista Hoyt had been subjected to an almost unimaginable level of violence. And then, The perpetrator had done something that would come to define the case, something that elevated him from a mere predator to a boogeyman. He had desecrated her body in a way that defied comprehension. In a final act of grotesque theater, he had severed her head, and he had placed it on a bookshelf facing the rest of her body, which he had, like the others, meticulously posed. This single horrific detail, when it was later leaked, was the one that broke the city. This was not a human act. This was the work of a monster. By Monday evening, the news was out. A killer was loose in Gainesville. He was targeting students, he was entering their homes, and he was performing rituals. The city's optimistic energy vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The word panic is not strong enough to describe what happened next. The University of Florida, a place of learning and light, became a fortress of terror. The impact was immediate and absolute. Gun stores sold out within hours. There was a citywide run on firearms, ammunition, deadbolts, and baseball bats. Students who days before were planning parties were now barricading their apartment doors with dressers, sofas, and refrigerators. No one slept alone. Groups of 8, 10, 15 students huddled together in single apartments, taking turns to stand watch through the night, jumping at every sound. The roads out of Gainesville were jammed. A mass exodus began. Parents, frantic with worry, drove in from all over the country, from Miami, from New York, from Illinois, to retrieve their children. They loaded up the still unpacked boxes and fled. The campus, so full of life 48 hours earlier, became a ghost town. The university, for a time, virtually ceased to function. Police patrols were quadrupled. Officers with shotguns walked the empty campus paths. A command center was established. The media descended, broadcasting the city's terror to a transfixed nation. This was a real-life horror movie unfolding live. And the killer was still there. He was watching. He was reveling in the fear he had created. And he was not finished. On the night of Tuesday, August 28th, while the city was in a state of armed lockdown, he chose his third and final location, the Gatorwood Apartments. His targets were 23-year-old roommates, Tracy Pauls and Manuel Tabawada. This time, the predator's plan was interrupted. When he gained entry, he encountered Manuel Tabawada. Manuel was not a small freshman. He was a 6'3", 200-pound former high school football player, and he fought back. A violent, desperate struggle ensued. The apartment was torn apart, but the intruder had the element of surprise and a weapon. He overpowered Manuel, ending his life with a ferocity born of rage at the unexpected resistance. Then he turned his attention to Tracy Pauls. He hunted her down the hallway as she tried to flee. He cornered her, and once again, he enacted his ritual. He assaulted her and he posed her body, leaving her in a manner that had become his signature. In just over 72 hours, 5 young lives had been extinguished. 3 crime scenes. A city of over 100,000 people was brought to its knees. The investigation was the largest in Florida's history. The predator was dubbed the Gainesville Ripper. Who was he? The police had clues. He was skilled. He entered the apartments with precision, often prying open sliding glass doors with a screwdriver. He was bold, striking in heavily populated student complexes. He was organized, yet savagely violent. In the woods near one of the apartment complexes, they found a makeshift campsite. It was littered with beer cans, scraps of food, and other items. The man who lived there, it seemed, had been watching, waiting. His name was Danny Rolling, but no one knew that yet. He was a 36-year-old drifter, a shadow with a long, dark past. He had come from Shreveport, Louisiana, fleeing a life of escalating crime. He was a sociopath, a product of a violent and abusive household, raised by a police officer father who had beaten him and his mother relentlessly. Rolling was consumed by a toxic brew of self-loathing and grandiose delusion. He fancied himself a musician, a singer-songwriter. He also fancied himself a superstar of crime. He had a dark, grandiose persona he called Gemini. He was, in his own mind, an avenging angel, an outlaw. He had fled Louisiana after a violent confrontation with his father. He drifted south to Florida, living in the woods, committing petty burglaries to survive. And in Gainesville, surrounded by the youthful innocence he both envied and despised, his dark fantasies finally boiled over into reality. He began to stalk his victims. He watched their routines. He planned his intrusions. He was not caught for the main crimes. Days after the final incident, on September 8th, he was arrested for a simple burglary at a local grocery store. He was just another thief, and he was put in the county jail. It was only when the crime lab began to process the evidence, the campsite, the tools, the biological traces left at the scenes, that the pieces clicked into place. The DNA matched. The tools from his backpack matched the pry marks on the doors. The man they had in custody for a petty theft was the monster who had paralyzed their city. The story of Danny Rolling and the Gainesville Terror is the very definition of a case that is scarier than fiction. Because fiction, in this case, is a direct and undiluted copy of the truth. The creator of the 1996 film Scream, Kevin Williamson, has been open about his inspiration. He was channel surfing and landed on a documentary about the Gainesville Ripper. He was struck by the image of a town under siege, of a killer who could be anywhere. He wrote the opening scene of his movie that night. But Scream is a Hollywood movie. It has rules. It has a final girl. It has a witty, self-aware script. The killers, when unmasked, have a clear, personal, and almost theatrical motive: revenge. The violence, while shocking, is stylized. The reality of Danny Rolling had no such comforting logic. First, there was no final girl. The victims in Gainesville were not protagonists in a story. They were random targets. They were asleep. They were caught completely unaware. They had no connection to Rolling. The horror was in its absolute, impersonal randomness. He chose them because they were there. Second, the motive. The Scream killers wanted revenge on the main character. Danny Rolling wanted fame. He was auditioning. He saw himself as the next Ted Bundy. He was consciously creating a legacy of terror. He wanted the media attention, the infamy, the superstar status. This motive, violence as a path to celebrity, is a chillingly modern and deeply disturbing form of evil, far removed from a simple revenge plot. Finally, and most terrifyingly, there is the performance. The fictional Ghostface makes threatening phone calls and plays a game. It's theatrical. Danny Rolling's theater was one of unspeakable desecration. The posing of the bodies, the use of mirrors to force the discoverers to see themselves in the scene, and the horrific, symbolic act performed on Krista Hoyt. These were not the actions of a movie slasher. They were the calculated, ritualistic acts of a profoundly disturbed mind, designed to inflict the maximum possible psychological trauma, not just on the victims, but on their families, the police, and the entire community. Mainstream horror films cannot show what Danny Rolling did. The reality is too grotesque, too nihilistic. The films must soften the blow, create a hero, and provide a motive we can understand. The truth of Gainesville is that there was no hero who could stop him. He was stopped days later by a simple burglary. The motives were not logical. They were the product of a broken, narcissistic mind. And the art he created was not a game. It was a testament to the darkest depths of human capability. At his trial, Danny Rolling was defiant. He sang to the courtroom. He showed no remorse. He was, in his own mind, the star of his own dark opera. He was found guilty, and after years on death row, his life was ended by the state of Florida. The town of Gainesville recovered, but it never fully healed. The innocence of that 1990 school year was shattered and never returned. The case left a permanent scar, a collective memory of a time when a real-life boogeyman walked among them, turning their sunny college town into his personal nightmarish stage. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper, but for the people who knew them, it never really ended. And while that family was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, another investigation was just starting. This predator didn't just want to be a star for a week. He wanted to play a game with an entire city. A game of codes and letters and terror. A game that, to this day, has never been won. In the popular imagination, the late 1960s in Northern California were a kaleidoscope of psychedelic color, peace, and free love. The Summer of Love in 1967 had supposedly redefined a generation, with its epicenter in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. But by 1968, that dream was curdling. The flowers were wilting. The optimism was being replaced by something harder, something darker. The specter of the Manson family was just over the horizon, and a new kind of paranoia was seeping into the counterculture. The era of unlocked doors and boundless trust was coming to a violent end. It was in this fractured, paranoid landscape that a new type of predator emerged. He was not a hidden, lurking monster. He was a performer. He was a media manipulator. He was a puzzle maker who craved the spotlight. And he would create for himself a name, a brand, and a legacy of terror that would make him the most famous and most terrifying uncaught perpetrator in American history. He called himself the Zodiac. The story does not begin with a letter. It begins with a cold, brutal, and seemingly senseless act. December 20, 1968, Lake Herman Road, just outside the blue-collar city of Vallejo. This was a classic lover's lane, a dark, isolated stretch of road known to every teenager in town. Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, were on their first official date. They had parked David's Rambler in a gravel turnout, just two high school kids looking for a moment of privacy. Another car, a light-colored sedan, pulled up alongside them. Then it pulled away, only to return minutes later, blocking their exit. A man emerged, holding a firearm. The details of what happened next are lost to the night, but the results were clear. David Faraday was found on the gravel turnout, a single, precise shot having entered his head. Betty Lou Jensen had apparently tried to flee. She was found several yards away, her back riddled with 5.22 caliber rounds. It was an execution. The Vallejo Police Department was baffled. There was no clear motive. No robbery, no assault. It was just a cold, methodical erasure of two young lives. The case was a puzzle with no pieces. It was a tragic but isolated local crime. For 7 months, there was silence. The case grew cold. Then, July 4, 1969, another lover's lane. This time, the Blue Rock Springs Park golf course, just a few miles from the first location. Darlene Farron, 22, a popular, vibrant young waitress, was sitting in her Corvair with her friend, 19-year-old Michael Mago. A car pulled up behind them, its headlights blinding them in the rearview mirror. The car sat there for a moment, then drove off. It was a common occurrence, perhaps other teenagers, and they thought nothing of it. But moments later, the car returned. It parked behind them again, blocking them in. A man got out, walked toward the passenger side of the Corvair, shining a high-powered flashlight directly into their eyes. Michael, annoyed, reached for his wallet, assuming it was a police officer. The man said nothing. He simply raised a 9mm pistol and began to fire. He emptied the weapon into the car, systematically, again and again. The small space of the Corvair was filled with shattering glass, explosions, and agony. Michael Majo was hit multiple times, in the face, neck, and chest. Darlene Farron was struck repeatedly.
As the man turned and walked calmly back to his car, Michael let out a scream of pain. The man stopped. He heard the sound. He turned around, walked back to the car, and fired 2 more rounds into each of them, a final, cold punctuation. Then he got in his car and drove away, slowly. Miraculously, Michael Majo survived. He had been a witness, but the horror of that night was not over. At 12:40 a.m., less than an hour after the attack, a phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department. The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, answered.
"I wish to report a double murder," the voice said. "If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." Then he hung up. The call was a bombshell. The perpetrator was not a silent predator. He was taunting them. He had just linked 2 crimes, 7 months apart, and claimed them as his own. But this was only the beginning. The perpetrator had a plan. He was not satisfied with a secret, a phone call. He wanted public recognition. He was about to introduce himself.
On August 1st, 1969, 3 envelopes arrived, one at the Vallejo Times-Herald, one at the San Francisco Chronicle, and one at the San Francisco Examiner. The envelopes contained nearly identical, handwritten letters. The writing was slanted, almost childlike, but the message was anything but. "Dear Editor," they began, "I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman Road and the girl on the 4th of July." The letters provided details of the crimes that only the perpetrator could know, establishing his authenticity. He described the ammunition, the brand of the weapons, the specific locations. But then came the performance. He was not just confessing, he was issuing a demand. Each letter was accompanied by 1/3 of a coded message, a cryptogram. He demanded that all 3 newspapers publish his cipher on their front pages by the following Friday. If they failed to do so, he wrote, he would go on a kill rampage and would cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with 12 people over the weekend. He had just taken the entire San Francisco Bay Area hostage. The media was in a bind. Do they print the ramblings of a madman, potentially inspiring copycats and giving him the fame he craved? Or do they refuse and risk him making good on his threat? They chose to publish. The mysterious 3-part cipher was splashed across the front pages. The entire Bay Area, a region already on edge, became a city of amateur codebreakers. The killer had just achieved his first goal. He was a media sensation. He had a name, given to him by the press, the Cipher Killer. But he wasn't satisfied. He would give them his own name. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one at the San Francisco Examiner. It began with a new, chilling salutation. "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." He had branded himself. He had created a persona. He even had a logo, a circle with a crosshairs over it, a symbol he would use on all future correspondence. He was no longer a simple predator. He was a supervillain in the comic book sense of the word. He also provided more details, taunting the police. "The Vallejo police are not doing a good job. I am not sorry for what I have done. I like killing people because it is so much fun." Then, on August 8, 1969, a high school teacher from Salinas, Donald Hardin, and his wife Betty cracked the 408 symbol cipher. The message within was a window into a deeply disturbed and chillingly grandiose mind.
I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the people I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. E Borie Temeth. The last 18 letters were gibberish, perhaps a failed attempt at a second layer of code. But the message was clear. The perpetrator was not just a thrill seeker.
He had a bizarre, self-created theology. He was collecting souls for his own personal paradise. The Bay Area was now in the grip of a full-blown panic. A man who called himself Zodiac, who believed he was collecting slaves for the afterlife, was hunting people. And he was about to create his masterpiece of terror. September 27, 1969, Lake Berryessa. It was a beautiful, warm autumn afternoon. Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, both college students, were picnicking on a secluded peninsula on the lake. It was a peaceful, idyllic scene. They noticed a man watching them from a distance. He was stocky, wearing glasses. He seemed to be just another person enjoying the park. Then he disappeared behind a small hill. A few minutes later, he reappeared, and what they saw was pure, distilled, theatrical horror. The man was now wearing a bizarre medieval-style executioner's hood. It was black with a bib that extended down his chest. On the bib, he had stitched his logo, the circle and crosshairs. He was wearing clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes of the hood. He looked, as Brian Hartnell would later describe, like something from a movie. In his hand, he held a large, bayonet-style knife. He approached them calmly. This was not a frenzied attack. This was a performance.
"I want your money and your car keys," he said, his voice the same flat monotone from the police call. He told them he was an escaped convict from a prison in Montana where he had killed a guard and he needed to get to Mexico. This, it turned out, was a lie. It was a script. He was setting a scene. He had Cecilia bind Brian with pre-cut lengths of clothesline. Then he bound Cecilia. He was, Hartnell recalled, almost nervous, his hands shaking slightly. But his demeanor was polite. He joked with them. He was putting them at ease, even as they were tied up at the mercy of a masked man. "I'm going to have to stab you people," he said, his voice still calm, as if discussing the weather. Brian, trying to reason with him, said, "But I'm only a college student. I don't have any money." Zodiac's response was cold. "It doesn't matter." He then plunged the knife into Brian Hartnell. Brian was stabbed 6 times in the back, the wounds so deep they punctured his lung. He then turned to Cecilia Shepard. He stabbed her 10 times in the back and abdomen. The attack was brutal, savage, and prolonged. He then, once again, walked away calmly. He left his victims for dead and went back to his car. On the side of Brian Hartnell's Carmen Gia, he used a black felt tip pen to leave his mark. He drew his crosshairs logo and wrote in large letters, "Vallejo 12-20-68, 7-4-69, Sept 27-69, 6:30 by knife." He had just signed his work, like an artist. At 7:40 p.m., a call came into the Napa County Sheriff's Office. The same monotone voice spoke. "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Gia.
And then the chilling description. I'm the one that did it. Against all odds, Brian Hartnell survived. He was able to give police the first and only detailed witness account of the Zodiac.
Cecilia Shepard held on for 2 days, conscious long enough to give a description, before she succumbed to her injuries in the hospital. The Zodiac had now escalated. He had attacked in broad daylight. He had worn a costume. He had left a written message. He was basking in the terror he was creating. And he was about to make his boldest move yet. October 11, 1969, just 2 weeks later. This time, he was not in a remote lover's lane. He was in the heart of San Francisco, in the affluent Presidio Heights neighborhood. A cab driver, 29-year-old Paul Stein, picked up a fare who was heading to the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets. When they arrived, the passenger, a stocky man with glasses, ordered Stein to drive 1 block further. Then he produced a 9mm pistol and, without a word, shot Paul Stein in the back of the head, ending his life instantly. The perpetrator then got out of the cab. He was seen by 3 teenagers across the street, who watched as he calmly reached into the cab, pulled Paul Stein's body into his lap, and appeared to be wiping. He was methodically wiping down the cab, and he was taking something. He tore a large piece from the back of Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt, a trophy. The teenagers called the police. The dispatcher, in the confusion, broadcast a report of a robbery and assault, and mistakenly described the suspect as a black man. Minutes later, 2 officers, Donald Folk and Eric Zelms, were racing to the scene when they saw a white man, stocky, with glasses, walking calmly down the sidewalk away from the scene. They slowed, asked him if he had seen anything. The man, who was almost certainly the Zodiac, gestured up the street and said he'd seen a man with a gun running in that direction. The officers, looking for a black suspect, thanked him and sped off. The Zodiac, the most wanted man in California, had just had a polite conversation with the police and then melted into the night. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. "This is the Zodiac speaking," it began. "I am the murderer of the taxi driver." He was furious that he wasn't being given credit. He provided a correction to the police, mocking them for their incompetence. "The police shall never catch me," he wrote, "because I have been too clever for them. P.S. The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly instead of holding road races with their motorcycles to see who could make the most noise. The pigs." And as his final, horrifying proof, the envelope contained a small, swatched square of fabric. It was the blood-soaked piece of Paul Stein's shirt. He had now established a pattern. He would commit an act, he would call, and he would write, providing proof. This game, this cycle of terror, media, and verification was his true motive. And the game was just beginning. He sent more letters, more ciphers. One, the infamous 340 cipher, remains unsolved to this day, a cryptic taunt from history. He sent a letter with a new, terrifying threat. He was, he claimed, construct a device. He was going to shoot out the front tire of a school bus. And then, as the children poured out, "I shall just pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." This threat changed everything. It was no longer about teenagers in cars or adults in cabs. He was threatening children. For the first time, he was threatening the entire social fabric. For weeks, school buses in the Bay Area and across California drove their routes with armed police escorts. Children were taught to stay low, to not run if their bus was ever stopped. The Zodiac, with a single letter, had weaponized the fear of an entire state. He continued to play. He sent a bomb diagram, claiming he had planted a device that would wipe out a city block. He sent a piece of Paul Stein's shirt to the celebrity lawyer Melvin Belli asking for help, claiming, "I am afraid I will lose control again." Then, perhaps his most brazen move. On October 22, 1969, a man claiming to be the Zodiac called the Oakland Police Department, demanding that one of two prominent defense attorneys, F. Lee Bailey or Melvin Belli, appear on a popular morning talk show, AM San Francisco. The city was electrified. The show was broadcast live. Melvin Belli, agreeing to participate, was on the line, and a man calling himself Sam called in. For an hour, live on air, a man claiming to be the Zodiac spoke to the city, his voice trembling, telling Belli he was sick and couldn't stop. It was a media circus, a cultural event, but it was a hoax. The real Zodiac, it turned out, had not been the caller, but the incident proved his power. He had, without even being present, hijacked the airwaves. And then, after a flurry of letters in 1970 and 1971, he just stopped. The letters became less frequent. The credible crimes ceased. The phantom who had held a city in his grip simply vanished. This is why the Zodiac is scarier than any fictional villain. In a movie, the supervillain always has a grand, elaborate plan. The Riddler in The Batman, a film that borrows heavily from the Zodiac case, has a purpose: to expose the corruption of Gotham. His game has rules and an end game. And, most importantly, he is caught. The hero, Batman, solves the riddle, confronts the villain, and justice is served. In Dirty Harry, a film directly inspired by the Zodiac, the Scorpio killer is a pale imitation. He is a chaotic, greedy man who is ultimately confronted and vanquished by the hero. The film is a fantasy, a wish fulfillment of what the city wanted to happen. The reality of the Zodiac is far more terrifying. His game may have had no purpose at all, other than the creation of terror and his own dark fame. He was not trying to expose corruption or preach a sermon. He was, quite simply, collecting slaves. His motive was as alien and incomprehensible as his cipher. And he was never caught. There is no third act. There is no final confrontation. The police, for all their efforts, were left with nothing. The prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, a man who fit the description, wore the same sized boots, and owned the same brand of typewriter, could never be definitively linked to the crimes. He passed away, a free man. The Zodiac won. He created a myth that has endured for over 50 years. He has inspired dozens of films, books, and documentaries. He has legions of online sleuths still trying to crack his codes. He achieved exactly what he wanted: immortal infamy. The horror of the Zodiac is not in the violence, though it was brutal. It is in the game. It is in the taunts, the costume, the media manipulation. It is in the power he wielded over millions of people with just a pen, a piece of paper, and a payphone. And it is in the silence. The fact that, somewhere, a man lived out his life, perhaps watching the news stories about himself, perhaps reading the books and watching the movies, knowing he was the one, knowing he had played the perfect game and won. That is a kind of horror that no fiction writer would dare to script. It is an ending that is too bleak, too unresolved, too real. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper. But for the people who knew them, it never really ended. And while that family was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, another investigation was just starting. This one was older, colder, and wrapped in the tinsel and tragedy of Hollywood. It began with a body severed in two and a smile carved into a face.
a grotesque work of art that would become the most infamous unsolved case in Los Angeles history. Los Angeles, 1947. The war was over. The city was not just a place on a map. It was an idea, a superheated dream shimmering on the desert horizon. It was a magnet for the young, the hopeful, and the beautiful, all pouring in by the trainload, convinced that the simple act of arrival was the first step to stardom. The streets were electric with post-war optimism, but beneath the tinsel of Hollywood, in the shadows of the palm trees, lay a darkness that was older and deeper than the city itself. It was a town built on illusion, and it was about to become the stage for a crime so brutal, so methodical, and so hauntingly bizarre that it would not only define an era, but would, over 75 years later, remain the most infamous unsolved case in American history. It was a case that would prove, in the most graphic way possible, that the darkest fictions of Hollywood were a pale imitation of the city's real-life nightmares. This is the story of the Black Dahlia. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was not the dark, mysterious, high-class femme fatale the newspapers would later paint her to be. She was, in almost every way, the archetype of the very people the city consumed. She was 22, strikingly beautiful, profoundly broke, and desperately ambitious. Her life had been one of quiet tragedies and restless movement. Born in Massachusetts, her childhood was fractured when her father, who had lost his savings in the 1929 stock market crash, faked his own end by parking his car by a river and simply vanished. He left his wife and 5 daughters, including Elizabeth, to fend for themselves. Elizabeth, who suffered from severe asthma, spent her youth bouncing between her family home in Medford and seasonal stays in Florida, chasing a climate that was kinder to her lungs. She was a creature of transience. In 1943, she learned her father was, in fact, alive and well, living in Vallejo, California. She traveled across the country to live with him, but the reunion was short-lived. They argued, and she left. This set the pattern for the rest of her brief life. She drifted. She moved from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara, back to Florida, then to Chicago, then back to Los Angeles. She was always on the move, always in search of something that remained just out of reach. She was, by all accounts, a captivating figure. She had pale blue eyes, jet black hair that she often wore piled high, and a habit of dressing in tailored black suits, earning her the nickname the Black Dahlia, a play on the popular 1946 film noir, The Blue Dahlia. But contrary to the lurid tales that would follow, she was not the promiscuous party girl of legend. Friends described her as someone who, due to a developmental issue, was not physically intimate. She was a teaser, a girl who would go on dates with servicemen and locals for a nice dinner, a place to stay, and the simple human comfort of companionship, but would almost always leave them wanting more. She was a survivor, using her beauty as currency in a city that demanded it. In late 1946, her drifting brought her back to Southern California for the last time. She was staying with various friends, bouncing between cheap hotel rooms and acquaintances' apartments. On December 9th, she took a bus to San Diego, where she met Robert "Red" Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman. They spent some time together, and on January 9th, 1947, he drove her back to Los Angeles. She had told him she was going to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston. She asked to be dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel, a grand, opulent landmark in the heart of downtown. Red Manley watched her walk into the grand lobby, a small, striking figure in her black suit, carrying her suitcases. He saw her make a phone call. She then turned, smiled, and waved. He waved back and drove away. It was the last time anyone could definitively and verifiably report seeing Elizabeth Short alive. She seemed to vanish. For 6 days, the city swallowed her. There were no calls, no sightings. She was just another hopeful face that had disappeared into the smog. Until the morning of January 15th. It was a cold, clear winter morning in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. Betty Bersinger, a local resident, was walking with her 3-year-old daughter, pushing her in her stroller. She was walking on the cracked sidewalk of Norton Avenue, a quiet residential street that bordered a vacant, weed-choked lot. She saw something in the tall grass, about a foot from the sidewalk. It was white. It looked, she thought, like a discarded department store mannequin, the kind with a joint at the waist. She saw that it was in 2 pieces. She walked closer, her daughter babbling in the stroller. The morning sun hit the white object. It was not plaster. It was not plastic. Betty Bersinger's mind struggled to process the image. She was looking at a human body, laid out in 2 distinct halves. She grabbed her child and ran to the nearest house, her screams shattering the morning quiet. The first police officers on the scene were not prepared. No one could have been. What they found in that vacant lot was not just a body, it was a statement. It was a grotesque and horrifying piece of theater. The body of Elizabeth Short had been positioned. The 2 halves were separated by about a foot. The lower half was laid out straight. The upper torso was placed with its arms raised up over the head, elbows bent. Her legs were spread wide in a vulgar, deliberate pose. But it was the details of the scene that sent a wave of sickness through even the most hardened officers. First, the separation. This was not a frenzied act with an axe. The body had been separated at the waist with the clean, precise skill of a surgeon. It was a procedure only someone with advanced medical training would know how to perform. Second, the scene was clean. There was almost no fluid at the scene, and very little left with the remains. The perpetrator had performed this act elsewhere, over a period of time, allowing the body to be completely drained before bringing it to the lot. Third, the remains had been prepared. The body was immaculately clean. It had been washed, scrubbed from head to toe. The perpetrator had taken the time to remove every trace of his own presence and every trace of the violence itself before displaying his work. And finally, there was the face. The perpetrator had taken a sharp instrument and had carved a grotesque, permanent expression onto her features, slicing the corners of her mouth upwards toward each ear in a horrifying, smile-like cut. There were other marks, other wounds, but the core horror was this: the surgical precision, the bloodless display, and the carved, mocking expression. This was not an act of passion. It was a ritual. It was a calculated, cold, and intelligent performance. The press descended like vultures. This was not just a story, it was a sensation. The city, already obsessed with celebrity and glamour, now had a dark, bloody celebrity of its own. It was William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner that truly ignited the firestorm. They got a tip on the victim's identity. They found Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, back in Massachusetts. In one of the most monstrous acts in the history of journalism, a reporter from the Examiner called Phoebe and told her that her daughter had won a beauty contest. For nearly an hour, they pumped the relieved, happy mother for every detail of Elizabeth's life, her dreams, her history, her boyfriends. Only after they had milked her dry of every personal detail, they dropped the mask. "We are sorry to tell you," the reporter said, "but your daughter, her life has ended." The next day, the Examiner ran the story, filled with the exclusive, intimate details they had just stolen from a grieving mother. The Herald Express, not to be outdone, ran lurid, fabricated stories of Elizabeth's promiscuous life, painting her as a wayward soul who had courted this dark end. The Black Dahlia, a nickname she had barely used in life, became her immortal, tragic brand. The LAPD was buried. The case was the biggest in the city's history. Hundreds of officers were assigned. But the media hysteria had done its work. The city was in a panic, and the investigation was drowned in a sea of false leads. And then, the false confessions began. Over 60 people, almost all of them men, walked into police stations and claimed responsibility for the crime. Each one had to be meticulously investigated and vetted, a colossal waste of time and resources. The case was becoming a circus, a dark carnival, and the police were losing control. Then, 9 days after the discovery, the case took a turn. The perpetrator, the real one, stepped out of the shadows. On January 24th, the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner received a package. It was a manila envelope, and it had been assembled with paste-up words cut from magazines and newspapers. On the front, it read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal effects, her birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, and, most chillingly, an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. This was the Zodiac's move, 2 decades early. It was a direct taunt to the police and the press, and the perpetrator had added his own signature of genius. Every single item in the package, including the envelope itself, had been meticulously wiped clean with gasoline. There was not a single fingerprint to be found. He was intelligent, he was organized, and he was playing with them. A few days later, a second letter arrived, this one a paste-up note sent to the police. It read, "I will give up. The Dahlia affair was justified." The city held its breath. Was he really turning himself in? Another note arrived shortly after. The tone had changed. "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a fair deal." And then silence. The Black Dahlia Avenger, as he had styled himself, vanished. He had made his statement, delivered his punchline, and melted back into the shadows of the city, leaving a case that would poison generations of detectives. The suspect list was, and remains, a labyrinth. It runs into the hundreds. There was Robert "Red" Manley, the last man to see her. He was polygraphed, questioned relentlessly, and finally cleared. There was Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose address book was in the package. Had Elizabeth scorned his advances? The evidence was purely circumstantial. The investigation branched out. Detectives looked at the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, a serial predator in Cleveland from the 1930s who had also taken his victims apart with surgical skill and had never been caught. Was this his return? They looked at medical students, surgeons, and even Hollywood figures. The case was too big, too strange. There were too many leads, too many theories, and no physical evidence. The perpetrator had designed the perfect crime. And the case grew cold. Decades passed. The file, thick with hundreds of names and thousands of pages of reports, became a monument to failure. Until a new, and perhaps the most compelling, theory emerged not from a detective, but from a detective's son. Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, began his own investigation. He was looking into his own father, Dr. George Hodel, a brilliant, enigmatic, and deeply sinister physician who had been a prominent figure in 1940s Los Angeles. George Hodel was not just a doctor. He was a man of immense intellect, a child prodigy with a genius-level IQ. He was part of the city's surrealist art scene, friends with figures like the artist Man Ray and the director John Huston. He was also a man of dark, unrestrained appetites. He lived in the famous Sowden House, a Mayan-inspired architectural landmark in Hollywood that was the scene of rumored orgies and dark, drug-fueled parties. In 1949, 2 years after the Dahlia incident, George Hodel's own daughter, Tamar, accused him of a terrible family betrayal. The trial was a Hollywood sensation. Hodel, with his high-powered attorneys, was acquitted. But the LAPD was now watching him. They were suspicious. They believed he was connected to more than just the accusations from his daughter. They suspected him of being the Black Dahlia Avenger. From February 18th to March 27th, 1950, the LAPD bugged George Hodell's house. They placed microphones throughout the Sowden house, listening to his every word. The transcripts from that surveillance are, perhaps, the most chilling documents in the entire case. For weeks, Hodell spoke of mundane things, but then the tapes captured him, in a moment of apparent rage, talking to an unknown associate. "Supposin' I did do the Black Dahlia," the transcript reads. "They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's gone." He was also recorded saying, "I'm not the man they're looking for. They're looking for a man who doesn't exist." A perfect, taunting, Zodiac-like phrase. The evidence was circumstantial, but overwhelming. George Hodell had the advanced surgical skill to perform the procedure. He had the intellect to wipe the evidence with gasoline. He had the dark, sadistic personality. And his handwriting, according to experts hired by his son, was a match for the taunting notes. As the DA's office began to build a case against him in 1950, Dr. George Hodell did what guilty men of power do. He fled. He abandoned his family and his practice and moved to Asia, where he lived out the rest of his life, a free man. He passed away in 1999. Was he the one? Steve Hodell is convinced. The LAPD, in its quiet, unofficial way, seems to agree. Many of the lead detectives on the case, now long retired, have stated they believe Hodell was their man. And this is what makes the Black Dahlia case the ultimate example of scarier than fiction. Horror movies, even the most brutal ones, have a comforting artifice. The violence, no matter how graphic, is stylized. No mainstream film, not Seven, not Saw, would ever dare to linger on the true forensic reality of what was done to Elizabeth Short. It is too cold, it is too real. The surgical precision is more terrifying than any chainsaw. A madman with an axe is a monster. A genius with a scalpel is something else entirely. He is a demon of intellect. Fiction requires a motive. The killer, when unmasked, has a reason. Revenge, ideology, greed. The motive of the Black Dahlia's perpetrator is a terrifying void. Was it a sadistic, artistic expression, as his friendship with the surrealists might suggest? Was it a medical experiment? Or was it simply the ultimate expression of power over a young woman the city had already deemed disposable? The lack of a why is the true horror. And finally, fiction demands justice. The hero confronts the villain. The case is closed. The light banishes the dark. The Black Dahlia case is a story of total, complete, and utter failure. The perpetrator, likely a man of wealth, power, and intelligence, performed his grotesque masterpiece in plain sight. He taunted the police, he taunted the media, and he taunted the entire city. He then watched the circus from his mansion in the hills, and when the heat got too close, he simply left. He got away with it. He got away with it all. This case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper. But for the city of Los Angeles, it never really ended. The file remains open, a wound that will not close. And while this family was trying to live with what they had, another city was already haunted by a predator who had come before. A shadow that had not just taunted the police, but had methodically broken the greatest lawman in America. September 23, 1935. On the gritty east side of Cleveland, two teenagers were walking along the edge of Kingsbury Run. This was not a park, it was a scar. A dried-up riverbed that sliced through the city, flanked by steep, garbage-strewn embankments. It was a dumping ground, a place where the city's refuse and its forgotten people collected. In the 1930s, the Run was home to a sprawling Hooverville, a shantytown of destitute men and women displaced by the Depression, living in shacks made of cardboard, scrap metal, and despair. As the boys walked, they saw something in the weeds. It was the lower half of a man's torso, from the waist to the knees. It was pale, almost unnaturally white, and had been expertly severed. There was no other part of the body in sight. The Cleveland police were called, but the victim was a John Doe, likely just another drifter. In a city struggling with mass unemployment and organized crime, the case of a few body parts found in a dump was not a high priority. Then it happened again. That same afternoon, a few miles away, the upper half of the same torso was found. But it was the head discovered nearby that truly signaled what they were dealing with. The head showed signs of a violent, savage end. And all three pieces had been cleansed. They were drained of blood. This was not a gangland hit. This was something else. The city, however, remained largely unaware. The victims were from the run. They were the invisible. Until the butcher chose a victim the city could not ignore. September 10, 1936, a full year later. A man walking to work near the run stumbled upon a horrifying sight. It was the upper half of a man's torso. But this time, the discovery was different. The head was still attached. The victim was easily identifiable. His name was Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old man with a minor police record, but a man who was known. He was not a faceless drifter. He had connections to the community. The scene was, once again, one of surgical precision. Andrassy had been decapitated. His body, like the one before, had been completely drained of blood. And, like the first victim, his other half was missing. It was found 2 days later, bobbing in the polluted waters of the Cuyahoga River. The press, sensing a sensation, latched onto the story. The Mad Butcher was born. Cleveland was now in the grip of a new kind of fear. This was not a normal crime. This was the work of a monster. And the city had just hired the one man they believed could stop him. Elliot Ness. The name itself was a legend. Ness was the untouchable, the heroic, incorruptible prohibition agent who, at least in the eyes of the public, was the man who had taken down Al Capone in Chicago. He was the real-life equivalent of a superhero. In 1934, he had been hired as Cleveland's public safety director, a move designed to clean up a city rampant with police corruption and gang violence. Ness was a reformer. He was a modern, scientific detective. He fired corrupt cops, he broke up rackets, he modernized the department. He was, by all accounts, winning. And then, the butcher dumped his first identifiable victim almost on Ness's doorstep. This was not a simple homicide. This was a challenge. The butcher, whether by accident or by terrifying design, had just engaged in a duel with the most famous lawman in America. The pressure on Ness was immediate and immense. He poured every resource he had into the case. He brought in his best men, the new, uncorrupted generation of detectives he had personally trained. The butcher responded. January 26, 1937. A woman's dismembered body was found on a beach on the shore of Lake Erie. She had been cut into 7 pieces. Her head was never located. February 23, 1937. Another female victim, found in the same area. Again, dismembered. Again, no head. June 6, 1937. Another victim, a John Doe, found under a bridge. July 6, 1937. Another victim, John Doe #4, pulled from the Cuyahoga River. The butcher was accelerating. He was not just a killer. He was a phantom operating with terrifying impunity. The city was in a full-blown panic. This is where the reality of the Cleveland torso murderer diverges from fiction and becomes so much more frightening. In a horror movie, the monster has a pattern. He has a type. The detectives, like in Seven or The Silence of the Lambs, eventually find the thread. They find the why, which leads them to the who. The Mad Butcher had no discernible why. His victims, in the end, totaled 12 confirmed. They were both male and female.
They were of various ages. They were of different ethnicities. The only thing that connected them was their vulnerability. They were the drifters, the prostitutes, the alcoholics, the residents of the shantytown. They were the people who would not be missed. This lack of a clear victimology is in itself a profound horror. It suggests a perpetrator who is not driven by a compulsion for a specific type. He is driven simply by the need to disassemble. He is a collector of parts. He is hunting humans as a simple resource. The true terror, however, lay in his methods. The autopsies, performed by the brilliant but besieged county coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, revealed a chilling, almost unbelievable truth. The perpetrator was an expert. The dissections were not the work of a frenzied maniac with a hatchet. They were clean, precise, surgical. The cuts were made with a long, incredibly sharp knife, possibly a specialized medical instrument. The vertebrae were separated with textbook precision. This was a person with advanced anatomical knowledge. A doctor, a surgeon, a butcher, a medical professional. But it was worse than that. Gerber's most horrifying discovery was that in several of the cases, the chemical signatures in the tissue indicated that the victims were likely still alive when the dismemberment began. The perpetrator was not just disposing of a body, he was engaging in a ritual of live, methodical dissection. This is a level of cold, scientific cruelty that almost no fictional work dares to portray. Fictional violence is hot, passionate, or quick. This was cold, patient, and clinical. This was the act of a man treating another human being as a slab of meat on a laboratory table. And then there was the art. The torsos were always left in plain sight, on the edge of the run, on the shore of the lake. They were displays, but the heads, and often the limbs, were almost never found. The butcher was keeping trophies. He was taking the one thing that defined his victim's identity, their faces, and he was leaving the anonymous, impersonal torso as his public statement. Elliot Ness was a man drowning. The pressure from the city, the press, and the mayor was unbearable. He was the hero who was supposed to stop the unstoppable, and he was failing. The butcher was running circles around him. Ness, in his desperation, began to make mistakes. He ordered massive, indiscriminate raids on Kingsbury Run. He and 100 officers, in an act that would be unthinkable today, descended on the shantytown. They rounded up hundreds of drifters. They questioned them. They intimidated them. And then, in a final, desperate act, Ness ordered the shantytown burned to the ground. He torched the homes of the city's most vulnerable, all under the theory that it would deny the killer his hunting ground. It was an act of a desperate man, and the butcher watched, and he mocked him. Soon after, a letter arrived, addressed personally to Elliot Ness. It was a taunt. The writer claimed to be the killer. He praised Ness for his good work in burning down the run, saying it had saved him the trouble. He was, he said, going to come to Ness's house and get him. The most famous policeman in the world was now a target. But the most chilling encounter was yet to come. In 1938, a body was found, and another, and another. The count was rising. The city was beyond panic. It was numb. Then, on August 18, 1938, Elliot Ness, in a move that seemed to come from nowhere, announced he had his man. His name was Frank Dolezal. He was a 52-year-old bricklayer, an immigrant, and a resident of the Run. He was also a known associate of one of the victims. Dolezal was arrested and held in the county jail.
He was subjected to days of relentless, brutal interrogation. The police, under immense pressure from Ness, were determined to get a confession. And they got one. Dozal, in a state of exhaustion and terror, confessed to one of the acts. But his confession was a mess. It was contradictory, physically impossible, and didn't match the forensic evidence. It was, clearly, the rambling of a man who had been broken in an interrogation room. Before any of this could be tested in court, on August 24, 1938, Frank Dozal was found in his cell. He was hanging. It was ruled a suicide. But the story didn't end. An autopsy, demanded by Dozal's family, showed that he had suffered 6 broken ribs after he had been arrested. He had been brutally beaten in police custody. Had the great Eliot Ness, the Untouchables, framed an innocent man? Had his officers beaten him so badly that he took his own life? Or had they done it for him? The city turned on its hero. The Butcher case had not only defeated Ness, it had corrupted him. And the final, terrible punchline? The killings stopped. After Dozal's suicide, the confirmed killings ceased. Was he the killer after all? Or had the real killer, his game now complete, simply retired? This is the ultimate horror of the Mad Butcher. In a movie, the hero always wins. The super cop, the untouchable, confronts the monster, and after a great struggle, he prevails. Justice is served. In reality, the monster won. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, whoever he was, defeated Eliot Ness. He broke him. He exposed the desperation and brutality beneath the hero's shining armor. The case destroyed Ness's reputation in law enforcement. He resigned a few years later, his career in shambles, and spent the rest of his life battling alcoholism, haunted by the Butcher case until his final day. The killer was never, ever identified. The most compelling suspect, a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney, was a brilliant but deeply troubled surgeon who had served in a medical unit in World War I, where he had gained extensive experience with amputations. He was an alcoholic. He was known to frequent the bars in the run. He was, in fact, personally interviewed by Ness. During the interview, Sweeney, a massive and physically imposing man, became erratic. He was clearly unstable. Ness, convinced Sweeney was his man, could never prove it. The evidence was all circumstantial. Sweeney, sensing the pressure, voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, where he remained, safe from prosecution, for the rest of his life. From inside the hospital, he continued to send taunting, cryptic postcards to Ness, harassing the man he had defeated. The case of the Mad Butcher is scarier than any fiction because it is a story of total, complete failure. It's a story where the monster is not a creature of the night, but a man of science, a surgeon, a man of intellect. It's a story where the violence is not chaotic, but cold, methodical, and clinical. It is a story where the hero doesn't just lose the game destroys him. There is no ending. There is no justice. There is only the silence from the run, the ghosts of 12 or more invisible people, and the chilling, eternal mystery of the man who could take a human body apart, piece by piece, and then vanish from history, leaving the greatest detective of his time a broken man. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper. But for the city of Cleveland, it never really ended. And while that community was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, half a century earlier, another man of science and intellect was building a monument to his own evil. He was not just a predator. He was an architect. He was a businessman. And he was building a hotel, a labyrinth designed for one purpose. It was a factory of death. And he was, perhaps, America's first and most terrifying horror movie villain. September 23, 1935. On the gritty east side of Cleveland, two teenagers were walking along the edge of Kingsbury Run. This was not a park, it was a scar, a dried-up riverbed that sliced through the city, flanked by steep, garbage-strewn embankments. It was a dumping ground, a place where the city's refuse and its forgotten people collected. In the 1930s, the Run was home to a sprawling Hooverville, a shantytown of destitute men and women displaced by the Depression, living in shacks made of cardboard, scrap metal, and despair. As the boys walked, they saw something in the weeds. It was the lower half of a man's torso, from the waist to the knees.
It was pale, almost unnaturally white, and had been expertly severed. There was no other part of the body in sight. The Cleveland police were called, but the victim was a John Doe, likely just another drifter. In a city struggling with mass unemployment and organized crime, the case of a few body parts found in a dump was not a high priority. Then it happened again. That same afternoon, a few miles away, the upper half of the same torso was found. But it was the head, discovered nearby, that truly signaled what they were dealing with. The head showed signs of a violent, savage end. And all three pieces had been cleansed. They were drained of blood. This was not a gangland hit. This was something else. The city, however, remained largely unaware. The victims were from the Run. They were the invisible. Until the butcher chose a victim the city could not ignore. September 10, 1936, a full year later. A man walking to work near the Run stumbled upon a horrifying sight. It was the upper half of a man's torso. But this time, the discovery was different. The head was still attached. The victim was easily identifiable. His name was Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old man with a minor police record, but a man who was known. He was not a faceless drifter. He had connections to the community. The scene was, once again, one of surgical precision. Andrassy had been decapitated. His body, like the one before, had been completely drained of blood. And, like the first victim, his other half was missing. It was found 2 days later, bobbing in the polluted waters of the Cuyahoga River. The press, sensing a sensation, latched onto the story. The Mad Butcher was born. Cleveland was now in the grip of a new kind of fear. This was not a normal crime. This was the work of a monster. And the city had just hired the one man they believed could stop him. Eliot Ness. The name itself was a legend. Ness was the untouchable, the heroic, incorruptible prohibition agent who, at least in the eyes of the public, was the man who had taken down Al Capone in Chicago. He was the real-life equivalent of a superhero. In 1934, he had been hired as Cleveland's public safety director, a move designed to clean up a city rampant with police corruption and gang violence. Ness was a reformer. He was a modern, scientific detective. He fired corrupt cops. He broke up rackets. He modernized the department. He was, by all accounts, winning. And then, the butcher dumped his first identifiable victim almost on Ness's doorstep. This was not a simple homicide. This was a challenge. The butcher, whether by accident or by terrifying design, had just engaged in a duel with the most famous lawman in America. The pressure on Ness was immediate and immense. He poured every resource he had into the case. He brought in his best men, the new, uncorrupted generation of detectives he had personally trained. The butcher responded. January 26, 1937. A woman's dismembered body was found on a beach on the shore of Lake Erie. She had been cut into 7 pieces. Her head was never located. February 23, 1937. Another female victim found in the same area. Again dismembered. Again no head. June 6, 1937. Another victim, a John Doe, found under a bridge. July 6, 1937. Another victim, John Doe #4, pulled from the Cuyahoga River. The butcher was accelerating. He was not just a killer, he was a phantom operating with terrifying impunity. The city was in a full-blown panic. This is where the reality of the Cleveland torso murderer diverges from fiction and becomes so much more frightening. In a horror movie, the monster has a pattern. He has a type. The detectives, like in Seven or The Silence of the Lambs, eventually find the thread. They find the why, which leads them to the who. The Mad Butcher had no discernible why. His victims, in the end, totaled 12 confirmed. They were both male and female. They were of various ages. They were of different ethnicities. The only thing that connected them was their vulnerability. They were the drifters, the prostitutes, the alcoholics, the residents of the shantytown. They were the people who would not be missed. This lack of a clear victimology is, in itself, a profound horror. It suggests a perpetrator who is not driven by a compulsion for a specific type. He is driven simply by the need to disassemble. He is a collector of parts. He is hunting humans as a simple resource. The true terror, however, lay in his methods. The autopsies, performed by the brilliant but besieged county coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, revealed a chilling, almost unbelievable truth. The perpetrator was an expert. The dissections were not the work of a frenzied maniac with a hatchet. They were clean, precise, surgical. The cuts were made with a long, incredibly sharp knife, possibly a specialized medical instrument. The vertebrae were separated with textbook precision. This was a person with advanced anatomical knowledge. A doctor, a surgeon, a butcher, a medical professional. But it was worse than that. Gerber's most horrifying discovery was that in several of the cases, the chemical signatures in the tissue indicated that the victims were likely still alive when the dismemberment began. The perpetrator was not just disposing of a body. He was engaging in a ritual of live, methodical dissection. This is a level of cold, scientific cruelty that almost no fictional work dares to portray. Fictional violence is hot, passionate, or quick. This was cold, patient, and clinical. This was the act of a man treating another human being as a slab of meat on a laboratory table. And then there was the art. The torsos were always left in plain sight, on the edge of the run, on the shore of the lake. They were displays. But the heads, and often the limbs, were almost never found. The butcher was keeping trophies. He was taking the one thing that defined his victim's identity, their faces, and he was leaving the anonymous, impersonal torso as his public statement. Elliot Ness was a man drowning. The pressure from the city, the press, and the mayor was unbearable. He was the hero who was supposed to stop the unstoppable, and he was failing. The butcher was running circles around him. Ness, in his desperation, began to make mistakes. He ordered massive, indiscriminate raids on Kingsbury Run. He and 100 officers, in an act that would be unthinkable today, descended on the shantytown. They rounded up hundreds of drifters. They questioned them, they intimidated them, and then, in a final, desperate act, Ness ordered the shantytown burned to the ground. He torched the homes of the city's most vulnerable, all under the theory that it would deny the killer his hunting ground. It was an act of a desperate man, and the butcher watched, and he mocked him. Soon after, a letter arrived, addressed personally to Elliot Ness. It was a taunt. The writer claimed to be the killer. He praised Ness for his good work in burning down the run, saying it had saved him the trouble. He was, he said, going to come to Ness's house and get him. The most famous policeman in the world was now a target. But the most chilling encounter was yet to come. In 1938, a body was found, and another, and another. The count was rising. The city was beyond panic. It was numb. Then, on August 18, 1938, Elliot Ness, in a move that seemed to come from nowhere, announced he had his man. His name was Frank Dolezal. He was a 52-year-old bricklayer, an immigrant, and a resident of the Run. He was also a known associate of one of the victims. Dolezal was arrested and held in the county jail. He was subjected to days of relentless, brutal interrogation. The police, under immense pressure from Ness, were determined to get a confession. And they got one. Dolezal, in a state of exhaustion and terror, confessed to one of the acts. But his confession was a mess. It was contradictory, physically impossible, and didn't match the forensic evidence. It was, clearly, the rambling of a man who had been broken in an interrogation room. Before any of this could be tested in court, on August 24, 1938, Frank Dolezal was found in his cell. He was hanging. It was ruled a suicide. But the story didn't end. An autopsy demanded by Dolezal's family showed that he had suffered 6 broken ribs after he had been arrested. He had been brutally beaten in police custody. Had the great Elliot Ness, the untouchable, framed an innocent man? Had his officers beaten him so badly that he took his own life? Or had they done it for him? The city turned on its hero. The butcher case had not only defeated Ness, it had corrupted him. And the final terrible punchline? The killings stopped. After Dolezal's suicide, the confirmed killings ceased. Was he the killer after all? Or had the real killer, his game now complete, simply retired? This is the ultimate horror of the Mad Butcher. In a movie, the hero always wins. The super cop, the untouchable, confronts the monster and, after a great struggle, he prevails. Justice is served. In reality, the monster won. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, whoever he was, defeated Elliot Ness. He broke him. He exposed the desperation and brutality beneath the hero's shining armor. The case destroyed Ness's reputation in law enforcement. He resigned a few years later, his career in shambles, and spent the rest of his life battling alcoholism, haunted by the butcher case until his final day. The killer was never, ever identified. The most compelling suspect, a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney, was a brilliant but deeply troubled surgeon who had served in a medical unit in World War I, where he had gained extensive experience with amputations. He was an alcoholic. He was known to frequent the bars in the Run. He was, in fact, personally interviewed by Ness. During the interview, Sweeney, a massive and physically imposing man, became erratic. He was clearly unstable. Ness, convinced Sweeney was his man, could never prove it. The evidence was all circumstantial. Sweeney, sensing the pressure, voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, where he remained, safe from prosecution, for the rest of his life. From inside the hospital, he continued to send taunting, cryptic postcards to Ness, harassing the man he had defeated. The case of the Mad Butcher is scarier than any fiction because it is a story of total, complete failure. It's a story where the monster is not a creature of the night, but a man of science, a surgeon, a man of intellect. It's a story where the violence is not chaotic, but cold, methodical, and clinical. It is a story where the hero doesn't just lose the game destroys him. There is no ending. There is no justice. There is only the silence from the Run, the ghosts of 12 or more invisible people, and the chilling, eternal mystery of the man who could take a human body apart, piece by piece, and then vanish from history, leaving the greatest detective of his time a broken man. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper.
But for the city of Cleveland, it never really ended. And while that community was trying to live with what they had, somewhere else, half a century earlier, another man of science and intellect was building a monument to his own evil. He was not just a predator, he was an architect, he was a businessman, and he was building a hotel, a labyrinth designed for one purpose. It was a factory of death, and he was, perhaps, America's first and most terrifying horror movie villain. If the Mad Butcher of Cleveland was a phantom who haunted the ruins of a city, our next figure was the exact opposite. He was a man who stood in the brightest spotlight imaginable, a beacon of American progress and ingenuity. He was handsome, charismatic, educated, and brilliant. And he did not need to hunt in the shadows. He built a machine, a modern, industrial marvel of a building, and invited his victims right inside. He constructed a labyrinth, a hotel that was, in reality, a factory. This is the story of Herman Webster Mudgett, better known to the world as Dr. H.H. Holmes, and his infamous, terrifying murder castle. The setting is Chicago, 1893. The city is the center of the universe. After a devastating fire 2 decades earlier, it has been reborn in white plaster and steel. It is the host of the world's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. This is the White City, a breathtaking, electric dreamscape designed to announce America's arrival as the dominant power on Earth. It has the first ever Ferris wheel. It has electric lights designed by Tesla. It has pristine lagoons and gleaming white palaces of industry and art. Millions of people from all over the globe are flooding into Chicago to witness this marvel. The city is overflowing with optimism, opportunity, and, most importantly, a constant churning river of anonymous people. It is a city of spectacle, a place where anything seems possible. And in this, it was the perfect hunting ground. On the city's south side, in the gritty, working-class neighborhood of Inglewood, just a streetcar ride from the gleaming White City, a new building was being erected. It was a massive, 3-story structure that took up an entire city block. To the neighbors, it was a mystery. The locals called it the castle. It was the property of a handsome, wealthy, and impossibly charming young doctor named H.H. Holmes. Holmes was the personification of the American dream. He was a graduate of the University of Michigan's medical school. He was an innovator, an entrepreneur, a pharmacist, and a real estate developer. He was always seen in the company of beautiful women, always flashing a warm, trustworthy smile. He was the perfect, civilized, modern man. He was also a complete fabrication. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. He was a lifelong con artist, a bigamist, a swindler, and a sociopath of the highest order. And the building he was constructing was not a hotel. It was his instrument. The construction itself was a masterstroke of deception. Holmes hired and fired countless different construction crews. He would hire a team to build one section, inspect their work, claim it was shoddy, and fire them without pay. Then he would hire a new team to build the next, completely different section. No single crew ever saw the full blueprint. No one, except Holmes himself, understood what the building was truly designed for. On the outside, it was magnificent. The first floor was a picture of legitimate business. It held his own gleaming modern drugstore and various other retail shops, a jeweler, a restaurant. This was the lure. A respectable, busy public space that invited people in, especially the thousands of young women flocking to Chicago, desperate for work and excitement. The second and third floors were the hotel. And this is where the fiction of Saw or the haunting of Hill House pales in comparison to the engineered reality of Holmes's design. The upper floors were a labyrinth of over 100 rooms. They were a maze of impossible architecture. There were staircases that led to brick walls. There were hallways that turned back on themselves. There were doors that, when opened, revealed a sheer, terrifying drop to the floor below. But the real genius was in the details. Many of the rooms were normal, rented to legitimate tenants, but scattered among them were his special rooms. These rooms were soundproofed, their walls lined with iron plates and thick asbestos. Many had no windows. The doors were the key. They were rigged so that they could only be locked from the outside. A guest could enter, but they could never leave. Holmes had a secret control panel in his own office. From this panel, he could control a series of gas jets that he had piped directly into the walls of these sealed rooms. He could, at his leisure, fill a room with gas, rendering the occupant unconscious. He built secret passages, chutes in the walls, as the press would later call them. These hidden, soundproofed corridors allowed Holmes to move through the entire building like a ghost. He could stand, unseen, just inches from his tenants, watching them, listening to them through specially designed peepholes. When a guest, often a young woman he had hired to be his secretary, or a traveler he had charmed and then taken out a fraudulent life insurance policy on, was selected, the process was terrifyingly simple. He would direct her to one of the sealed rooms. He would lock the door from the outside. He would, perhaps, watch her for a time. Then he would turn the valve. Once the occupant had expired, his factory would truly begin its work. In one of his soundproofed, sealed vaults, he had installed what appeared to be a large metal slide. It was a greased chute, and it led directly to the basement. The basement of the murder castle is what separates Holmes from every other predator in history. The basement was not a place of chaotic, passionate violence. It was a place of industry. It was a processing plant. When police finally entered this subterranean level, they found a scene of scientific, industrial horror. They found a large, blood-soaked surgical table, surrounded by a pristine set of medical instruments. This was his dissection table. They found a massive, custom-built kiln, large enough for a human body. This was his personal crematorium. They found vats of acid. They found pits of quicklime. They found a medieval-style stretching rack, which Holmes would later claim was simply an invention he was working on. Holmes was not just a predator. He was a businessman. He was not just driven by a dark urge. He was driven by profit. His process was terrifyingly efficient. A victim would be brought to the basement via the chute. There, on the surgical table, Holmes, the trained physician, would meticulously dissect the remains. He would strip the skeletons of their flesh. The flesh and organs would be dissolved in acid, burned in the kiln, or buried in the quicklime pits. The skeletons, however, this was his masterstroke. The skeletons he would meticulously clean, bleach, and re-articulate, and then he would sell them. He sold the perfect, undamaged skeletons of his victims to the very medical schools and universities he had attended, institutions that were always in desperate need of anatomical specimens. He had created the perfect, horrifying, self-sustaining loop. He lured victims in with the promise of a job, he charmed them, he took out insurance policies on them, he ended their lives, and then he sold their component parts for a profit. It was a slaughterhouse designed by a genius. The horror of fiction simply cannot compete with this. Fictional villains like Jigsaw in the Saw films create elaborate, moralistic traps to teach a lesson. Holmes built traps not for a moral purpose, but for an economic one. Fictional haunted houses are tormented by ghosts and supernatural forces. Holmes's castle was haunted by something far more terrifying, a single, living, rational, and calculating human mind. The sheer audacity is what chills the bone. He did this not in a remote, isolated cabin. He did this in the middle of America's second largest city, during the most celebrated public event in its history, right under the noses of the entire world. How many people entered the castle and never left? The number is impossible to know. The World's Fair was a river of transients. Young women, full of hope, would write to their families, "I've arrived in Chicago. I found a wonderful job with a kind doctor named Holmes." And then the letters would just stop. Their families back home would assume they had simply run off or found a new life. No one knew to even look for them. Holmes was a black hole, and the World's Fair was his perfect cover. The press, in their hysteria, would later claim 200 victims. The true number is likely between 27 and 100, but the fact that the number is so unknowable is, in itself, the core of the terror. So, how was this master, this architect of evil, finally caught? It was not the castle. It was not the dozens of missing women. It was, as is so often the case, a simple, mundane human crime: insurance fraud. Holmes had a long-time accomplice, a carpenter and con man named Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes and Pitzel hatched a plan. They would fake Pitzel's passing. They would get a John Doe body, disfigure it in a lab explosion, have Holmes identify it as Pitzel, and then Pitzel's wife, Carrie, would collect the $10,000 life insurance policy, which they would all split. It was a classic Holmes con, but Holmes had no intention of splitting the money. He sent Pitzel to Philadelphia, and there, instead of faking the act, Holmes simply rendered Pitzel unconscious and incinerated him, using his real body for the scam. He then charmed the unsuspecting, grieving widow, Carrie, into giving him custody of 3 of her 5 children: 15-year-old Alice, 12-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking and psychologically cruel chapters in American crime. Holmes, the charming Dr. Holmes, became the guardian of the 3 Pitzel children. For weeks, he traveled with them across the country, from Indianapolis to Detroit to Toronto. He was, by all accounts, a kind and doting uncle. He bought them new clothes. He took them to the zoo. All the while, he was also traveling with their mother, Carrie, often in parallel. He had convinced her that her husband, Ben, was alive and in hiding in London. He was sending her on a wild goose chase across the country, while he had her 3 children in his possession. He was, in effect, toying with an entire family, pulling their strings like a puppet master. But the children were a loose end. They missed their mother. They were asking questions. In Toronto, he checked into a hotel with the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie. He then left, carrying a large trunk. Later, a tenant in the house he had rented nearby found the 2 girls' naked remains buried in a shallow grave in the cellar. He had taken 8-year-old Howard Pitzel to a different house in Indianapolis. There, he ended the boy's life, dismembered his small body, and incinerated the pieces in a simple wood-burning stove. Police would later find fragments of the boy's teeth and bones in the chimney flue. It was this, the cold, methodical elimination of children, that finally brought the law down on him. A Pinkerton detective, Frank Geyer, was hired by the insurance company. Geyer was not a hero like Eliot Ness. He was a quiet, meticulous, relentless bloodhound. He did not care about the castle. He cared about the Pitzel children. He patiently tracked Holmes's journey, city by city, hotel by hotel, tracing the path of the charming doctor and the 3 lost children. It was his discovery of the children's remains that finally exposed Holmes, not as a swindler, but as a monster. Holmes was arrested in Boston. He was brought back to Philadelphia to stand trial, not for the dozens of victims in his castle, but for the one provable act against Benjamin Pitzel. It was only after his arrest that police and reporters in Chicago finally entered the castle. It was then, and only then, that the world learned the truth. They pulled back the walls. They found the gas pipes. They followed the chute to the basement. They found the acid vats, the kiln, and the surgical table. They found the bone fragments. The city that had celebrated the White City was now confronted with the reality of its dark twin, the murder castle. Holmes, ever the performer, confessed. He confessed to 27 acts. Then he confessed to over 100. Then he recanted. Then he claimed he was possessed by Satan. He played games with the press until the very end. He was found guilty, and when he was led to the gallows, his final terrifying request was that his own casket be encased in a massive block of concrete. The man who had dissected and disassembled so many others was terrified in his final moments that the same thing might happen to him. Fiction, this Halloween, gives us the haunted house. It gives us ghosts. It gives us families tormented by unseen forces. But the story of H.H. Holmes is the story of a man who looked at the modern world, at science, at industry, at architecture, at capitalism, and saw them only as tools to build a better, more efficient slaughterhouse. He is the true ghost in the machine. That case was finally over for the detectives, at least on paper, but for the people who knew him, it never really ended. Holmes, the architect of evil, was finally stopped. His castle was a physical place. The horror was contained. But what happens when the horror has no building? What happens when it enters a normal family home, in a quiet, God-fearing town, performs an unspeakable act, and then vanishes, leaving only a dark, unshakable legend? The true American haunted house.